The key themes that we will encounter in Luke, and biblical scholars will pick up different themes, but largely I think it's a story of identity and mission. Who is Jesus and what is he about? So I know who I am and what I'm about. I know who we are collectively and what we are about. And if we miss that community dimension, we've missed a big part of the story. We transformed missionaries together. And we get lots of stories where people are paired together. This is the story of discipleship. And we'll see characters who do it superbly, and we'll see characters that fail miserably. And we'll mention Peter. He's like that. He gets it, then he doesn't get it. Then he gets it, and then he doesn't get it. And then he didn't get it at the climax of the story. But we know that wasn't the end for St. Peter. So we have a very merciful God that does not judge us on our one act. This message of the kingdom of God, we're going to hear this time and time again. What is this kingdom of God? The stories tell us. It's a realm of inclusion. It's a realm of welcome. Everyone is welcome. It's a realm of joy, of justice, of peace, of love, compassion. And that's why we're still waiting. We still pray, your kingdom come, because we know we're not quite there yet. But we know what we need to strive for, and we know when we're missing it. We just know, you feel it. You feel uncomfortable when you have not responded positively to something. You just know it. You don't need somebody to give you feedback. This notion of prayer that Jesus prays before he is baptised, he prays before he prays in the desert, he prays before he chooses the disciples, he prays in the Garden of Gethsemane. At significant moments, Jesus prays, and in the infancy narrative, they're praying all the time. Prayer is a really strong theme. It starts with prayer, it ends with prayer. Zechariah is praying, the disciples are praying again. Prayer, joy, praise. And if we miss it, we've missed it. We also get this sense of table fellowship. Jesus eats with the people nobody else wants to eat with, and is really, is scandalised because of it. The people of status and position are very critical of this. So look at the feeding stories. When does Jesus sit at table, and who does he sit with? And what conversations happen there? And even for ourselves today, who would be the people who Jesus would eat with? And they would be the most objectionable figures of society. And for sensitivity, I won't name them, but you can imagine them yourself. Who are the pariah of society today that Jesus would still have compassion and mercy for, and would offer them a place at the table, with the hope of restoration, of forgiveness and of healing? It is conditional. It's unconditional love, but it is conditional, because we need to respond to it. And universal salvation, that means this is the good news for everyone, not just people of high status, low status. It's not just for people that have got religious positions. This is the good news for everyone, which is why we're going to meet such a tapestry of characters. Some of the passages that are unique to Luke the tradition would be much poorer without them, and we possibly don't realise how much we rely on them. The episode of the Annunciation, it's the opening line of the Hail Mary. Blessed are you, favoured one of God. If we didn't have that story, and then if we didn't have Elizabeth responding to Mary in the visitation, we wouldn't have the first two lines of the Hail Mary. How many artists depict this encounter, this Annunciation, that you was there? the Son of God. How poor we would be without that. So these are some of the rich, unique contributions that Luke offers us. A literary device, look out for places. You know, as I said, quite often we're working with isolated units. Take time to read what comes before and what comes after. Try and work out where they are in the story, because that will shape what Luke's doing here. So the Gospel begins and ends in Jerusalem, and in particular it begins and ends in the temple in Jerusalem. Jerusalem was a very significant place, it still is today, and we heard the news come through this morning that the Prime Minister is open to the possibility of having the Australian Embassy in Jerusalem. And we still react. I'm looking at reactions across the group. You know, we still react to Jerusalem. And it's this hot bit of reaction because we're so invested in it. Biblically, we're familiar with that's where Mount Moriah is, where Abraham sacrificed, or was prepared to sacrifice Isaac. Could you imagine him going home and telling Sarah that? And they struggled to have this child, and they had this miraculous conception, this child, and then he's prepared to sacrifice. That would have been a game man. Then with King David, he unites the kingdom of the north and the south and sets Jerusalem up as the headquarters. So it's a very significant place. It becomes very significant politically, religiously, socially, economically. And then, of course, it's David's son Solomon who builds the first temple. Then we have the sacking of the north of Israel by the Assyrians, but it's the Babylonians that come through in the 6th century before the Common Era and sack Jerusalem and destroy the temple. And we enter into that period of the exile. So the two big episodes that form the consciousness of Judaism even to this day, the Exodus and the exile. And they still remember that today. And it forms their liturgies. And then after a period of time, the king of Persia, or the Persians then defeated the Babylonians, and he sent them back. He was very tolerant of their God and sent them back with money to build a second temple. And then so in the mind of the Israelites, they've just had oppression, because then what happens between the Babylonians and Jesus is the Greeks sweep through and then the Romans sweep through. And if you remember our map, it's because of its very strategic position on that Mediterranean basin. You know, it's the cross path from the Silk route, the spice route across the Mediterranean. So it's a very strategic location. The Gospel moves, the journey narrative is really particular in Luke, and we get material there that we'll get in no other Gospel. So if something's happening between 9:51 and 19, that's generally particular to Luke. And we get some of the great parables there, some of the unique teachings there. That becomes really the mini manual. What does it mean to follow Jesus day by day? What are the reactions? It's a gospel of acceptance and rejection. And for the disciples, they're going to be accepted and rejected. And when he sends the 70 out, as we saw at the beginning of tonight's session, when we read the rest of those verses, we'll find that, sometimes they will encounter peace, other times they will encounter hostility. So what is he saying for Luke's community? What is he saying for us today? So Jerusalem is the place where Jesus is rejected, raised, exalted. Then where we see right at the end of Luke and then through to the Acts of the Apostles, where the apostles, the disciples are empowered and they continue the ministry. And we have this wonderful, almost if you can imagine an X, the shape of an X, we have the story in Luke making its way to Jerusalem, and then we get to the end of Luke and the beginning of Acts, and then they make their way out. So it's a really clever use of location and geography to promote the theology. Another literary device that we get is this notion of reversal. You know, the mighty are brought down low, the lonely are exalted. Sinners, outcasts, marginalised are the new righteous. Jesus eats with tax collectors and sinners and is rebuked by most Pharisees. And then we have distinctive parables from Jesus that will tease this out. The Good Samaritan and the prodigal son. This notion of reversal. You think you're righteous because you've done the right thing, but you don't have the room in your heart to welcome your brother back. You can't even call him your brother. He is this son of yours. This son of yours, not my brother. So who is out in the dark? Who needs the compassion and mercy of God shone upon him? It's the one that's counting everything. And as I said before, I recognise that. And the powerful, really the mystery of sacred text is that these words can speak profoundly to our experience in ways that we think nobody else can understand. Family dynamics. Then we have a ministry in Galilee where we get mixed reactions. Accepted, rejected. It's really interesting after the rejection in the synagogue in Nazareth, when they're saying, who is this? Isn't this the carpenter's son? They're very challenged by what he says. The next person that talks about his identity and gets who he is the unclean demon, whom a man possessed. So the demons get it, but the people in the synagogue don't. Who've been reading about the promise of God. And then when it happens, they don't believe it. It's like when a student has a real transformation. That's what we're on about in education. Growth and transformation. And then when they do, we go, wow, when did that happen? We're surprised by what we believe should be happening. We'll see in a moment, Zechariah is, the greatest figure of that. It's great privilege in the temple. And then he's struck mute because he's so disbelieving of the power of God. We made that wonderful long journey to Jerusalem. Then we arrive in Jerusalem and it's very contentious there. It's really heating up here. For those of you that have been blessed to get to the Holy Land, you can understand it. Because up in Galilee, it's cruisy. It's balmy, it's lovely, and you're sitting on the Sea of Galilee, and you can dip in and cool yourself off, and then you head down to Jerusalem. It's in the middle of the desert, everyone's hot and cranky. So when Luke says at 9:51, he set his face to Jerusalem, yes. So imagine being up in Cairns, he set his face to Sydney or to Canberra. That's the polarity. This is the centre where he knows, and he knows this is where prophets do not survive. So this is a journey of fulfilment. Jerusalem will be the location of his destiny, and he knows it. Then we have the passion narrative, and then the resurrection narrative. We won't have time to look at some of the material I prepared on the passion narrative, but just to alert you to the fact, as I said before, Jesus dies as he lives. That we have a look at how Jesus dies on the cross in Luke compared to how he dies in Mark. In Mark he's saying, my God, why have you abandoned him? And we bereft when we read that. We cry when we read that. When we venerate the cross on Good Friday, that's the suffering we take to the cross. And it's the suffering we try to take from the cross if we're competent to be able to do that. But the death of Jesus in the Gospel of Luke has a more contained Jesus. Jesus is in control. Again, a lovely activity. Look at what the words are of Jesus when he is dying on the cross across the Gospels. And the words of Jesus in the Gospel of Luke are of forgiveness, are of inclusion, and are of prayer. Beautiful. Device of parallelism. We get the foretelling of the birth of John the Baptist, the foretelling of the birth of Jesus. We get the birth of John the Baptist, we get the birth of Jesus. But constantly throughout it, it's to underscore John is great, Jesus is greater. John represents the fulfilment of old Israel. He is a prophet in the prophetic line. His parents are observant, devout Jews. At no point does Luke paint any character as being unfaithful to Judaism. Mary, Joseph, Simeon, and Anna, the 6 characters of the infancy narrative, John the Baptist and Jesus, but they're infants, with the 6 adult characters that represent biblical piety. And Luke, that's what I'm saying, right from the beginning, Luke is saying this is a story of continuity and fulfillment, not of God has changed God's mind. I'm trying out the new group. My dear parish priest who went to God last year, he was a wonderful man. He always said, if you can't be bothered reading the whole Gospel of Luke, just read the first 2 chapters. That's the overture. That gives you the whole Gospel in a nutshell. You're going to encounter everything in the infancy narrative that you're going to encounter in the unfolding story. Now remember that Luke is writing to Theophilus, friend of God, God friend, whether he's the financial patron, whether he is a group of people, to see that in Jesus all God's promises have come to fulfilment and that God is generous beyond measure. God is generous beyond what we think we deserve, and that humbles us. That God reverses human expectation and creates human possibilities in impossible situations. That's why we pray. That's why people ask us to pray. So I remember daily the people that ask us to pray because we know that unlikely things can happen through our faith and through our prayer. Luke wants his readers to feel the joy, trust, faith, everything who responded to God's actions, but particularly Mary. We're told straight up who Jesus is. From the lips of these great figures of biblical Israel, we're told who Jesus is and what he's going to do. And in Simeon's canticle, we know that there is the oracle that predicts what's going to happen. And that line that Simeon says, it's on the reverse of your page that you have before you, verse 34. Then Simeon blessed them and said to his mother Mary, this child is destined for the falling and the rising of many in Israel, and to be a sign that will be opposed, so that the inner thoughts of many will be revealed. Listen to this. And a sword will pierce your soul too. That's the pain of being in relationship. Whether it's someone that you've birthed, someone that you've loved, someone that you love who was birthed, your niece, your nephew, your godchild, your own children. That sword of loving, how vulnerable it is to be in relationship. Like how dynamic is this text that it speaks to our human experience today? What other literature prevails? The good news is for everyone. The shepherds represent the poor. They represent the recognition of that group of people who recognised who Jesus was, the lowest on the social strata. Simeon, just above it, we see that this will be a light for revelation to the Gentiles. This is universal salvation. This child has been born for everyone. And even just beyond the infancy narrative, technically it's not an infancy narrative, but in chapter 3 we see the family tree, and compared to Matthew's family tree that goes back to Abraham, Luke traces the family tree back to Adam, the father of all humanity. So, there's lots of little hints here, there's lots of clues. So if you've arrived at the end of the infancy narrative and you haven't picked them up, you've been distracted. You've been focusing on that fruit mince pie that's waiting for you. So we get this status reversal. We're introduced to wonderful characters. We're given King Herod, Caesar Augustus, so locating it in time. And then we're given these great religious characters, these great people of biblical piety, the continuity of Israel's expectations. Now remember, this social setting is one where social status and stratification is really defined. It's very, very clear. It's a world defined around power and privilege. And there's a list there of the different ways that power and privilege is measured. And who do we get that interrupts this and challenges our thinking or discombobulates our understandings? We get these figures, these two women, Mary and Elizabeth. So it's beautiful to see that image captured with Mary and Elizabeth that on Greene. Elizabeth is the daughter of Aaron, we're told this in the text. Married to Zechariah, a priest, we're also told this in the text. He is high status, high privilege. Yet she's a barren woman. And to be barren, to be aged and to be barren, people would be whispering, what sin has she committed? Because children are blessings from God. So to be childless is to be cursed by God. So this is public, it's out there. God intervenes and her honour is restored, and you can read her response there. For Mary, though, we're given all the connections of all the other characters, but Mary, we're just told she's betrothed to Joseph. No lineage. So, absolutely paired back to just this young woman. Yet we know how the story goes. That this person of relatively low status is the one who is absolutely exalted by God's grace. The balance of power is also questioned. Herod came to power despite strong opposition from Jewish elders in Jerusalem. His reign was associated with economic and cultural problems. So he doesn't use his leadership for positive influence. Caesar Augustus gives us an indication that this is happening in the time of the Roman Empire. So Luke's he's making the point to locate this story in place and time, even though some commentators will say, well, this didn't happen then and this didn't happen then. Remember, this is a theological narrative. This is helping us to reflect on who God is and what we're invited into, rather than a historical chronology. That's not what we're reading here, and we'll get ourselves tied up in knots if that's what we try to defend. So in and amongst all of this turbulence and chaos and this misuse of power and privilege, this little infant comes in, and look at this beautiful image here, and we're supposed to rejoice. Who is bound in swaddling cloths and laid in a manger. Totally vulnerable, totally at the mercy of another. Is that not something that's telling us disciples what our disposition should be? You know, we live in an age where we value independence, that we have children's milestones based on when they can do things on their own. And that's wonderful, because that's all developmental. But somewhere in and amongst that, we might lose the opportunity to remind them to remain dependent on God, because we know the irrelevance of God for many people, and not just young people. Disaffiliation is happening throughout the demographics. The reaction of Mary when she finds out that her aged relative is with child is she sets off with haste. I love it. She sets off with haste. So what should disciples do? Think about it. Have a strategic plan. Get on with it. We know what we need to do. We know when other people need us, and it's not often at our convenience. How beautiful in those 3 words. Set off with haste. That's what we should do as disciples. Don't dilly-dally around. Get on with it. And then the shepherds. So we see the shepherds. They indicate that Jesus is here for the poor, the outcast. He's not born among kings or royalty. They are a very low status in Jewish society, often considered dishonest because they might have been grazing the sheep on somebody else's land. They weren't able to observe Jewish purity laws just because they couldn't get around to wash. You know, water wasn't out there in the field with them. And this is a device. It's another little indicator that Jesus is here for even the lowest in that social status. Who would be the lowest in our social status today? Refugees. Thank you. If you want to sort of split up a happy party, throw that one in the conversation. So, you know, who are the parallels today? So when you're planning your sacred spaces, when you're planning your prayers, I'm sure you're already doing this. Who are the parallels today? But again, come back to, this isn't somebody else's mission, this is mine. And even if all I can do is help change the attitude of somebody else, if that's all I can do, if I can't get out to the refugee centre, you know, there's lots of other ways we can exercise our influence. The unique contribution of Luke comes in the form of the canticles, the 3 canticles of Mary, of Zechariah, and of Simeon, and you have a copy of them there before you. It would have been a rich activity for us to have gone through those slowly, and I'd encourage you, if you are here with a group, to do that when you go back for your planning, to take the opportunity to sit with it, to read it, to really meditate on it, but to meditate on it with curiosity. What does that mean? Why would that word be there? What am I seeing here? Like to really analyse the text. What stands out for you? This stands out for me. Have a dialogue around it. So let's see what comes up in these canticles. So we have this canticle of Mary. The Guatemalan government banned the recitation of the Magnificat in the 1980s because they thought it was such a radical prayer of social justice. And it is. It's topsy-turvy. It's turning everything up. This is this motif of reversal. So in this story, we have 2 women encountering each other. We have 2 unlikely pregnancies, no doubt trying to come to terms with that. And we would know that Mary, and this is where, sympathising Matthew's account with Luke's, we know that, Mary as an unwed woman who is with child could have paid for that with her life. So, this isn't just some, let's just sweep up, well, that's a bit inconvenient. This was life-threatening because it challenged the social and religious expectations. But we have two women encountering each other. And in that encounter, they bring individual stories together. And those individual stories start to form this shared community understanding, this theological reflection of God's activity in their lives. But not for them, but for what this means for humanity. This is really rich theology. This is a model of theological reflection. That I bring my situation into dialogue with somebody else's, and we look at where do we create the God space in it. How do we make sense of this in light of what we know about God and what we expect from God? And this is where the canticles come from. This is the response. It's a response of praise and of joy. But not of just somebody thinking this is lovely, you're going to have a baby. This is understanding who this baby is and what this baby will be called to do for the rise and fall of many. We have these parallels again. What happens at the beginning, we might see echoed at the end. The obedience of Mary is parallel with the obedience of Jesus. Not your will, not my will, but yours. Will that be my prayer this Advent? God, let it be your will, not mine. You know, we've got a great tradition of wonderful saints that's been their mantra in the face of great opposition. So in my small world, in my small life, can that be my prayer this Advent? Your will, God. How do I know what God's will is? I've read the Gospel of Luke. I know it. So the other parallel we have at the beginning, we've got witnesses that are quite unlikely. We've got shepherds at the beginning. Who's going to listen to them? And then we've got a centurion at the end who declares who this is hanging on the cross. We have strong women in Luke's infancy narratives. Joseph's silent in Luke's infancy narrative. In Matthew's infancy narrative, Mary is silent. So these women are, that first meeting of people of faith is Mary and Elizabeth. So this is why some people say Luke is the gospel that promotes women and the discipleship of women, the faithfulness of women. And we have women in the Passion narrative, women that follow Jesus and provide for him and for others out of their own resources, so out of their own wealth. They're providing for others. And we look at Luke 8:1-3, it tells us there. And those women are there again at the crucifixion, albeit at a distance. Those women are there on the day of resurrection. So women are consistent. And it's almost like an unlikely check. Why would we have the testimony of women? So it has to have been accurate. The resurrection, there must have been absolutely, without flaw, for them to rely on the witness of women, when the witness of women didn't stand up in court. So these were faith statements, and they were believed. And we have this device called the inclusio. Again, I've said it a few times. Have a look at what happens at the beginning. We're going to see it again at the end. And even just with location, we'll see it. It begins in Jerusalem, it begins in the temple. And it begins on the same note of joy and praise. What's Luke telling his disciples? Pray, be joyful. The founder of the De La Salle brothers wrote some really interesting letters. I think he might have been grumpy some days and they're still surviving. And he wrote to one brother that must have been complaining about something, and he said, "Don't walk around with a face like a prison door." We're people of the gospel. Sometimes catch yourself in a mirror or a reflection in a window. We sometimes can look like we don't believe the message. We are called. We are invited into something beyond our imagining. And those first two chapters reveal this to us.